Here's something nobody told you about the fall of the British Empire. It didn't collapse because of military defeat or revolution. It imploded because of a spreadsheet. In 1947, Britain stood at a crossroads most superpowers eventually face, owing more money than the entire value of its economy, twice over. The debt-to-GDP ratio hit 238%. To put that in perspective, imagine owing your bank 5 times your annual salary, then being told you need to keep making payments while your income shrinks every month. That was Britain's reality. And here's the disturbing part. The United States just crossed $38 trillion in national debt in October 2025, representing 121% of GDP. The pattern isn't just similar, it's identical. Same hubris, same spending psychology, same outcome trajectory. We're watching history repeat itself in real time, and most people don't even notice they're living through it. The question isn't whether America will follow Britain's path. The question is whether we've already passed the point of no return. Let me take you back to 1945. The war is over. Britain has won. Churchill is celebrated as a hero. The Union Jack still flies over territories spanning a quarter of the globe. On paper, everything looks victorious. Behind closed doors, however, the Treasury knew a different story. Britain had burned through virtually all its foreign currency reserves. The country had liquidated roughly 10% of its foreign assets just to stay in the fight. More critically, Britain owed the United States $4.4 billion in World War I debt, money they'd never paid back during the Depression, plus billions more from the recent conflict. American Lend-Lease, which had kept Britain supplied with food and weapons, ended abruptly in August 1945, just days after Japan surrendered. President Truman had no choice. The law required it. Suddenly, Britain needed to pay for imports it couldn't afford. The economy had been running at 55% wartime production. Factories built tanks, not toasters. Shipyards produced destroyers, not commercial vessels. Transitioning back meant rebuilding everything while broke. John Maynard Keynes, already in failing health, was dispatched to negotiate. He warned that Britain's global ambitions had become financially untenable. Nobody wanted to hear it. The loan Britain secured, $3.75 billion from the U.S. plus another $1.19 billion from Canada, came with strings attached. The most devastating condition, sterling convertibility. 1 year after ratification, on July 15, 1947, foreign holders of British pounds could exchange them for dollars. Within a month, nearly $1 billion drained from British reserves. The government was forced to suspend convertibility and implement drastic spending cuts. Bread, never rationed during 6 years of war, now required ration cards. This is where the psychology of decline begins, not with the debt itself, but with the choices made afterward. Britain faced a fork in the road. Option 1, accept diminished status, reduce military commitments, invest aggressively in industrial modernization, and rebuild economic competitiveness. Option 2, maintain the appearance of being a great power while the financial foundation crumbled beneath them. They chose option 2. In 1950, Britain spent 9% of GDP on defense. Germany, recently defeated and occupied, spent virtually zero. Britain invested just 9% of GDP in its future. Germany invested 15% in factories, machinery, and industrial infrastructure. Within a generation, West Germany's economy surpassed Britain's. The country that won the war lost the economic race. The pattern repeated with almost comedic precision. Britain clung to empire commitments in the Middle East, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Expensive military outposts that generated minimal economic return now that colonies were gaining independence. India, the crown jewel, became independent in 1947. The benefits of empire were evaporating, but the bills kept arriving. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France and Germany used Marshall Plan funds to modernize industries. Britain used those same funds largely to maintain global prestige and pay down wartime debts. By the 1960s, British railways still ran on steam and mechanical semaphore signals, while European competitors operated modern systems. The consequences weren't immediate. That's the dangerous part. In 1950, the UK economy was 80% larger than Germany's. Living standards in Britain towered over continental Europe. The decline felt gradual, almost imperceptible year to year, but compounded over decades, and by 2022, Britain's economy had shrunk to 18% smaller than Germany's. The decline coexisted with absolute growth. GDP per capita tripled, which masked the relative collapse. Britain got richer in absolute terms while falling behind everyone else. That psychological trick, mistaking absolute growth for success while losing competitive position, explains why nations sleepwalk into irreversible decline. The debt itself wasn't fatal. Post-war Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio fell from 238% in 1947 to around 50% by the late 1970s without implementing crushing austerity. How? Sustained economic growth averaging 2.3% annually, combined with inflation averaging 6.5%. When your economy grows faster than your interest payments, debt becomes manageable. The real killer wasn't the debt. It was the choices made while carrying it. Britain chose prestige over productivity, global commitments over domestic investment, and the appearance of strength over actual competitiveness. Each decision seemed rational in isolation. Cumulatively, they produced catastrophe. Now let's talk about what America's doing right now. The parallels are so precise, they're almost eerie. The United States hit $34 trillion in debt in January 2024, $35 trillion in July 2024, $36 trillion in November 2024, and crossed $38 trillion in October 2025. That's the fastest accumulation of $1 trillion in debt outside of the pandemic. Unlike Britain's war debts, which were at least incurred fighting existential threats, much of America's recent debt growth comes during peacetime prosperity. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced corporate tax revenue significantly. The 2025 fiscal year saw a deficit of $1.83 trillion, despite the economy growing. Interest payments on the debt now consume $879.9 billion annually, more than Medicare, more than defense spending. That's $879.9 billion that generates zero economic return, zero infrastructure, zero innovation. It's pure overhead. Here's where it gets worse. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits averaging 6.3% of GDP over the next 30 years under current law. Debt held by the public could reach 156% of GDP by 2055. Under an alternative scenario, extending tax cuts, enacting additional reductions, debt could surge to 220% of GDP. That would reduce national income by approximately $4,375 per person in inflation-adjusted dollars. We're not talking about hypothetical futures. These are mathematical certainties unless policy changes dramatically. The psychology driving American debt expansion mirrors Britain's post-war mindset with uncomfortable precision. America maintains global military commitments dwarfing any potential rival. Over 750 military bases in 80 countries. Defense spending approaching $900 billion annually. These commitments made strategic sense during the Cold War. Do they make economic sense now? Britain asked the same question in 1950 and answered incorrectly. The United States spends roughly 3.5% of GDP on defense while simultaneously running massive deficits. That combination, global military presence plus structural deficits, is precisely the trap that broke Britain's economic spine. Consider another parallel. Infrastructure investment. America's infrastructure gets a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Roads, bridges, water systems, and electrical grids built in the 1950s and 60s now crumble from deferred maintenance. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act authorized $1.2 trillion over multiple years. Impressive until you realize China invested more than that in infrastructure in a single year. While America borrows to maintain global commitments and fund current consumption, competitors invest in future productivity. That's not speculation. That's Britain's exact playbook from 1945 to 1970. The interest rate environment creates a particularly dangerous illusion. For years, the United States borrowed at near zero rates, making debt appear costless. But interest rates aren't staying low. They've climbed to levels not seen since before the 2008 financial crisis. Higher rates mean two things. First, each dollar of new debt costs more to service. Second, when existing debt matures and needs refinancing, it rolls over at higher rates. The Congressional Budget Office estimates this rate environment will add $2.5 trillion in debt service costs over the next decade. That's $2.5 trillion in interest payments that could have built high-speed rail, modernized the electrical grid, or funded technological research. Instead, it vanishes into creditors' pockets. Britain learned this lesson the hard way in the 1920s. After World War I, debt interest absorbed 44% of all government expenditure, exceeding defense spending until 1937. The Treasury implemented austerity to balance books while interest payments strangled growth. The 1920s saw British growth underperform European neighbors by 22 percentage points. Statistically significant underperformance directly attributable to policy choices. The United States now pays roughly 14% of federal revenue in interest, projected to grow substantially. We're in the early stages of Britain's interest payment trap. The political economy of decline follows predictable patterns. Britain's politicians in the 1950s and 60s understood the mathematical reality, but couldn't muster the political will to make hard choices. Reducing military commitments meant admitting diminished status. Cutting spending meant angering constituencies. Raising taxes meant electoral risk, so they temporized, delayed, and hoped economic growth would solve structural problems. It didn't. Growth helps, but it can't overcome fundamentally unsustainable fiscal trajectories. The same political paralysis grips Washington today. Republicans oppose tax increases. Democrats oppose entitlement reforms. Both parties support ever larger defense budgets. Nobody wants to be the politician who admits American power rests on a foundation of borrowed money. That's how Britain sleepwalked into managed decline. Not through any single catastrophic decision, but through a series of politically expedient choices that compounded into irreversible trajectory. There's a timing element that makes this especially dangerous. Britain's decline unfolded over 60 years. That gradual pace meant each generation could rationalize the situation, attributing problems to temporary factors rather than structural flaws. America's decline, if it follows suit, will happen faster. Global capital moves instantaneously now. Currency crises that took months to develop in the 1970s can unfold in hours today. When confidence breaks, it breaks suddenly. The 2022 UK bond market crisis, triggered by Prime Minister Liz Truss's unfunded tax cuts, demonstrated how quickly markets punish fiscal irresponsibility. British government bond prices collapsed in days. The Bank of England had to intervene to prevent pension fund failures. Truss resigned after 49 days, the shortest prime ministership in British history. That episode proved debt matters, even for developed economies, especially during high inflation and rising interest rates. The United States benefits from an enormous advantage Britain lacked: the dollar's status as global reserve currency. Roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. That creates persistent demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, allowing America to borrow at rates other countries couldn't access. But this advantage isn't permanent. History shows reserve currency status eventually erodes. Sterling was the global reserve currency before the dollar. The pound's dominance ended not with a bang, but with a whimper as creditors gradually shifted to dollars. The same could happen to America. China, Russia, and other nations actively work to reduce dollar dependence. The internationalization of the yuan proceeds slowly but steadily. Any significant shift away from the dollar would immediately increase U.S. borrowing costs, potentially triggering the kind of crisis Britain faced in 1976 when it sought an IMF bailout, the first developed nation forced to do so. Here's what makes this genuinely frightening. Unlike Britain, America can't fall back on being part of a larger economic bloc. Britain eventually joined the European Economic Community in 1973, integrating into a larger system that cushioned decline. The United States has no such option. American economic dominance is binary, either sustained or lost. There's no soft landing, no gradual integration into a multipolar system that preserves prosperity. The fall from reserve currency status to ordinary economy would be abrupt and devastating. The domestic consequences mirror Britain's experience with unsettling precision. Britain's post-war generation expected and received a welfare state, national health service, expanded education, social security. These programs were built assuming continued prosperity. When growth faltered, the political system couldn't adjust. Attempts to cut spending triggered strikes, social unrest, and government collapses. The winter of discontent in 1978 to 1979 saw garbage piling in streets and bodies unburied as public sector workers struck against wage controls. That social breakdown paved the way for Thatcher's election and radical restructuring. America's entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, are structured similarly to Britain's welfare state. The Congressional Budget Office estimates Social Security spending at $1.6 trillion in fiscal year 2025, Medicare at $992 billion. These programs serve vital functions, but they're funded through mechanisms that assume perpetual economic growth and manageable debt levels. If growth falters while debt compounds, the political system faces an impossible choice: slash benefits, raise taxes dramatically, or inflate away obligations. Britain tried all three. None were politically sustainable. The generational implications are particularly stark. Young Americans inherit an economy where $38 trillion in debt translates to roughly $109,000 per person. That's not a direct obligation. Government debt doesn't work like personal debt, but it represents real economic burden. Higher debt crowds out private investment. The CBO estimates that for every dollar the government borrows, private investment falls by 33 cents. Less investment means slower productivity growth, which means slower wage growth, which means diminished living standards. A recent analysis shows that if debt continues on its current trajectory, it could reduce income in 2055 by nearly 24% compared to scenarios with controlled debt. That's generational wealth destruction measured in trillions. Britain's young people in the 1960s and 70s faced a similar reckoning. The generation that grew up during post-war austerity expected prosperity. What they got was stagnation, inflation, unemployment, and social breakdown. The punk rock movement emerged directly from that economic despair. The Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen wasn't just cultural rebellion, it was economic rage. American youth culture hasn't reached that breaking point yet, but the economic preconditions are assembling. Student debt, unaffordable housing, stagnant real wages, and dim retirement prospects create powder keg conditions. Add fiscal crisis to that mix, and the social cohesion holding American society together could fracture rapidly. There's a path forward. It's not comfortable, but it's mathematically possible. First, honest accounting. Stop pretending current trajectories are sustainable. The Office for Budget Responsibility projects UK debt could reach 350% of GDP in 50 years if current policies continue. American projections show similar unsustainability. Acknowledge the reality. America faces a choice between painful fiscal adjustment now or catastrophic crisis later. Second, prioritize investment over consumption. Every dollar of government spending should be evaluated by whether it enhances future productivity or merely maintains current consumption. Infrastructure that enables economic activity gets priority. Military commitments that don't serve core national interests get reconsidered. Entitlement programs get restructured to remain sustainable long-term. Third, accept that solving this requires both revenue increases and spending cuts. Britain's mistake was trying to grow out of the problem without addressing structural imbalances. That didn't work in the 1960s and won't work now. The political difficulty cannot be overstated. No elected official wins votes by promising sacrifice. Britain's politicians couldn't build consensus for necessary reforms until crisis forced their hand in 1976. By then, options had narrowed dramatically, making adjustment more painful than if addressed earlier. America still has time to choose controlled adjustment over forced crisis, but that window closes. Every year of $1.8 trillion deficits, every additional trillion in debt, every percentage point increase in interest rates narrows the range of viable options. At some point, and nobody knows exactly when, the math becomes insurmountable. Markets lose confidence. Crisis becomes inevitable. That's not fear-mongering. That's historical pattern recognition. Britain's decline didn't destroy the nation. British citizens today live comfortable lives by any historical standard. But Britain lost its position as global power, surrendered its empire, accepted diminished international influence, and watched Germany, France, and other nations surpass it economically. Britain went from writing the rules to playing by others' rules. That transition from hegemon to middle power happened slowly enough that no single generation experienced catastrophe, but the cumulative loss over 60 years was profound. America faces the same trajectory. The question isn't whether decline is possible. Britain proved it absolutely is. The question is whether Americans have the political courage to make hard choices before circumstances make them inevitable. The $35 trillion mistake wasn't Britain's debt. It was the choice to maintain the trappings of power while the foundation crumbled. America now faces that identical choice with $38 trillion on the line. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes with disturbing consistency. The pattern is clear. The outcome is predictable. The only variable is whether we're smart enough to break the cycle or arrogant enough to believe it can't happen here. Right now, the odds don't look good.